With a good spiritual retreat, Haley Stewart writes, when we retreat from the world with a good story, we are equipped with clearer vision. We stop to ask, what kind of story am I a part of? Is it nihilistic or is it characterized by gospel hope? Haley Stewart on children's literature, Word on Fire Spark, and their new release, Saintly Creatures, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Haley Stewart is a wife, mother, podcaster, author, including books such as Jane Austen's Genius Guide to Life and the Sister Seraphina series, and the editor of Word on Fire Spark, an imprint for young readers. No one is quite sure when she sleeps. Haley Stewart, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Segment 1, Meet Haley Stewart. I've heard it said that having children is like having a spotlight shined on your soul. All the imperfections, flaws, and selfishness become clearly visible. In such an intimate setting, our own sins become more obvious to us, and the conflict of different personalities in close quarters can challenge us. It's almost like rough rocks being jumbled together day after day until they become polished and beautiful, prepared to reflect the light of Christ to the world. These are the words of Haley Stewart, a wife of a beekeeper and whiskey distiller, the mother of 4 growing children, a graduate of Baylor's Great Text Program, editor of Word on Fire Spark, and a Catholic convert. Haley, we're starting here, and I'm not sure where to begin. There's so many intriguing paths to take. So what I'd like to do is to start with the rough rocks being jumbled together until they become polished and beautiful. Tell me a little bit about your family.
Sure. So I'm married to Daniel, who's my high school sweetheart, and we've been married for almost 18 years now.
Wow.
And then we have 4 wonderful children. Our oldest is a boy. He is almost 15. And then we have 3 little girls. Our youngest is 5. And we recently had a big move across the country recently, a year ago, but it still feels new because it was a lot. And also made a big transition from homeschooling into sending our kids to school. So a lot of big things going on at our house, but it is a busy, full life.
You know, in the midst of this, it's interesting to hear you, moving from Waco, Texas over to Tallahassee, going from homeschooling to into the schools, and then obviously assuming your role, and we'll talk about this more later in the podcast, as editor of Word on Fire Spark. A lot of changes. Sometimes people talk about the duck kind of sailing kind of calmly and coolly on the surface of the water while the feet are paddling furiously underneath. Is that the kind of life you're leading right now, would you say?
Yes, it definitely feels that way. And I think the big transition in season has been interesting too, because it felt like we just had little kids who were exhausting in a certain way. And now we have big kids who are so much easier in some ways and yet need to be driven so many places. We're just in that season where there's no drivers, but there's a lot of people who need to go somewhere. But it is so exhausting and also really exciting just seeing these children become tweens and teens, cultivating friendships, trying out different sports, different arts, and just seeing them become these fascinating people. It's a great season. So it's busy but great.
Well, I'm so happy for you. And obviously, you as a wonderful, happy Catholic married couple with many, many irons in the fire. I know that you're showing them how it's done, and they've got great guidance in you guys as parents. So congratulations, and I wish you well on the continued transition. I'm sure there's a couple of unopened boxes here and there still laying around the house, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, goodness. Don't talk about the garage. I just don't want to think about it.
Well, let's do this. Let's go back a little bit, and since we want to delve into you and books and reading and your role now, I'm going to start a little bit by kind of going back to Baylor when you're in the Great Text Program, and I want to ask you about what kind of books you read in college and how those books changed you, and if there were any bits of advice or insights that mentors offered you in terms of how to be a thoughtful reader.
Sure. We just had incredible professors in the Great Text Program. And we still keep up with many of them, which is such a blessing. But I think for us, this was the season where we were being drawn to the church. So we're both Catholic converts. And what we were reading kind of in two different genres, I think deeply influenced our conversion. So one of those is our first exposure to the early church fathers. Growing up Protestant, we just hadn't ever read St. Augustine. We hadn't ever read St. Ignatius of Antioch. And so diving into those texts with professors who took them very seriously and were modeling for us how to read well and really wrestle with these ideas, that was incredibly jarring and disorienting to us as Protestants, because it was calling into question a lot of our misconceptions about the Catholic Church and really helping us see that if this is the way that St. Ignatius of Antioch is talking about the Eucharist, or obedience to the bishops, or all of these very Catholic ideas in a very Catholic way, and this is so close to the time of Christ, it just really made us wrestle with our misconceptions about the church and church history and all of these things. So that was happening on one side of our brain. And then it was also our first exposures to some of the great Catholic novels. So Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh was hugely influential for me. I remember finishing the book. There's an incredible scene towards the end about a character receiving a sacrament. And I just remember like crying in my backyard, finishing this powerful book and thinking like, I have to get that grace. Like, I believe in this sacramental grace in a way I didn't before I started this book. And so that was huge for me. And then for my husband, I think Flannery O'Connor was probably the biggest fiction influence on his conversion. I think something clicked about the way that she talked about faith and about sin and grace and all of these ideas. And so just encountering those texts was hugely influential on our conversion. And then what finally gave us the push across the Tiber was when our oldest child was born, and we knew we were going to become Catholic at some point, but knowing that he needed to receive baptism was kind of that final push across the Tiber for us.
It's an amazing story. And it's amazing. What always gets me is here you have these young, vibrant college students sitting in a classroom reading ancient texts. And, for those people who think, oh, so many college students are just vapid and only thinking about the superficial and so on, here are the two of you going through a profound, a seismic shift in your faith system and in your priorities and so on. And it's also, I know you guys got married, if I'm not mistaken, after your sophomore year of college, I think you've said. And I just imagine the two of you sitting at the dinner table, regaling each other with, you were talking about Lord Marchmain, in those final pages of Brideshead Revisited, and that moving scene, and he's telling you about the grandmother being shot by the misfit in Flannery O'Connor. I can only imagine how lively the conversations are, but they're not lively just in the sense that, boy, I read this today. What did you think of this, and so on. This is material that is actually transforming you in your relationship with God. Do you think you grappled the nature of how grand of a transformation was happening in you at the time, or is it mostly you're seeing it in retrospect?
That's a really good question. I think it's just kind of that slow process of you have these misconceptions or you have these ideas, and they're slowly crumbling piece by piece.
Yeah.
And then as you encounter idea after idea and start to wrestle with it and then are convinced by what the church teaches, then you think, well, what about these other ideas that I used to think were crazy? Now I'm going to engage with them in good faith, because I'm convinced about these other things. So, okay, I'm ready to hear about Mary. I'm ready to hear about all this stuff I thought was weird. And so I think it was just a slow journey. And then once our son Benjamin was born, his presence in our life was such a grace that kind of gave us that final push. Okay, you know this is the direction you're headed, and now is the time to go.
Yeah, that's incredible. Haley, tell me about not only what you read, but tell me now about how you read. What are you being taught by these teachers that are professors that are they're taking apart the or explaining the nuances of Augustine or Ignatius of Antioch or Brideshead Revisited. What are they telling you in terms of how you approach these books? How are you supposed to read these books so that you unpack the meaning that will have a lasting impact on your life?
I think that the most important thing that was modeled for us was to read with humility.
Mm,
Read assuming that there's something of value in this book. I might not agree with all of that's written here, um, but this is an important book for a reason. So it's worth wrestling with. It's worth entering ready to really engage with these ideas and not just dismiss them out of hand. Um, and then I think there's a flip side to that as well, that my favorite professor from Baylor is Ralph Wood, who studied the Inklings among Flannery O'Connor and other writers, but religion and literature professor. And I took an Inklings course with him, and he said, this course is not so that we will all be cheerleaders for the Inklings.
yeah,
We're coming
yeah.
to really wrestle with these ideas, and we're going to give these authors the respect of really reading critically. We're not just here to go rah, rah, rah.
Yeah.
We love C.S. Lewis.
Yes,
Or, whatever.
yes.
And so I think that kind of those two pieces where you're reading with humility, that yes, I have something to learn, but also reading very critically.
That's great. That's a great way of putting it. Alan Jacobs, who I think is a professor at Baylor right now, wrote a book called Breaking Bread with the Dead. He probably is after your time there, but one of the things he said is when you read old literature, you're a guest at their table, they're not a guest at yours. And so it was interesting because there's obviously a lot of literature that's under fire nowadays for language or for social conceptions and so on and so forth. And so it's basically these full entire works are dismissed. And what he's saying is understand that there are, just like you're sitting at a table and you're a guest at the table and there's different parts of the meal that are being passed in front of you. You may say thanks, but no thanks to certain parts of the meal and enjoy other parts and still walk away having been well fed and having been treated with good hospitality. You may not go back for dinner again, or you may say, I want more. But the long and the short is you're a guest at their table. They're not a guest at yours. And as such, you can walk away learning, but not having to assent to every last aspect that you encountered there. Is that kind of is there an ethos of that form in the kind of education you got out of Baylor?
I think absolutely. I love that image, because I think that's very much something that happens when you're engaging with someone's writing. It's a form of hospitality where they're inviting you in to have this conversation with them, which is really an intimate situation.
It is.
So yeah, I love that image. I think that's a great way to think about it.
Segment 2, why children's books? What I remember most about growing up, Haley Stewart writes, was the experience of a slow-paced childhood with time to get bored and then dive into what interested me. It was self-directed. Lots of days biking to the library and then reading in my treehouse. Haley, what did reading in that treehouse mean to you and what did it do for you?
Sure. So I love reading in many genres, but I probably first in my heart is good children's literature. And I think part of it is because how formative it is to our understanding of the world, who we are and our place in the world, and even things like, what does it mean to be a woman, or what does it mean to be a man? And you're kind of looking at these different stories and they're forming your imagination of what does that really mean? And so those early stories that are forming our understanding and helping us navigate the world are just so important. And that's why I love the work that I get to do in children's publishing, because I can't imagine anything more important. I think that the stories that we believe shape everything about the way we live our lives. And so if we're not formed by stories that are true, we're going to be lost as we try to make our way through the world. And I think we see that a lot in just so much confusion for our young people in what kind of universe am I living in? You know, what kind of story is this? Who am I in the story? And I think about different stories that I loved reading as a little girl, like the Anne of Green Gables series by Lucy Maud Montgomery, which I think is just such a great depiction of both growing up, girlhood, moving into womanhood, and also like what it would look like to have a beautiful romantic relationship in marriage. Like the romantic relationship that develops in that story is so beautiful and good that I think that those things really shaped my imagination as I grew and was then looking for a spouse. That I think it's good to have our young people compare your potential spouses to some of these really fine characters who, you know, are still relatable, are still flawed, but are good models for what kind of story we want to be a part of in our lives. And so I think all of that is just so key. And one thing that this is kind of related to just what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, but I love Dr. Abigail Favali's book, The Genesis of Gender, and she talks about a lot of those issues. But I saw her speak a couple of years ago, and she was saying, you know, it's no wonder that our young people are so confused about the narratives of femininity and masculinity, because we've kind of presented them with a narrative that would say what it means to be a woman is to be victimized, and what it means to be a man is to be predatory. And so any sane person would look at these narratives and say, well, I want no part of that. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be a predator. And so forming the imagination with, you know, the truth about what that means, I think is just it's so important for every part of our lives to have our imaginations formed with what is good and true.
You know, that's so well said, Haley. And I think the word that you're saying over and over again that just grabs me is the notion of narrative. I mean, a story is a narrative. I mean, it unfolds as you turn the page, but there is, you know, there is something about all of us trying to grapple with our own narrative as we counter everybody else's narrative. How does what I'm seeing in the Anne of Green Gables in these relationships, how does that reflect what I want? Or how does that reflect what I know? How does that reflect what I don't want? And if at the end of the day, you're either a child that never reads or is read to, or what you encounter either in books or in film are sort of decadent, deformed, kind of warped notions of narrative, it's no wonder, like you said, people get lost, they get confused, they get despondent, they become sort of, you know, I don't want to say hopeless, but they to some extent, they despair at a young age. They don't have to. It's also very encouraging to me to the notion that here you are, a young girl reading Anne of Green Gables. You know, you can show a book like that to any number of kids nowadays. They're like, I don't want to read that. It's like reading, it's like reading Moby Dick or Oliver Twist or whatever. And yet you read this book, which is enduring and predates its writing, predates your entire life, and it was utterly transformative to you, as you've described.
Yes. I think that's just one of the things that's most exciting about books for children is both how deeply influential they are and how so many of the ideas are so enduring, the experiences across time. And I think that with children's literature now, there's still a lot of good stuff being written. So I'm not perhaps as doom and gloom about it as some people are. But I do think that if the vast majority of what we're presenting to children is presenting them with something that is very dystopian, that is something that's very dark, then what we're communicating is this is the way the universe is. You know, that
Yeah.
it is crumbling, it is hopeless, and it is bleak. And there
Yeah.
is already enough of that that we all have to deal with in life. You know,
Amen.
there is a lot of times where it's hard to be hopeful. This is a human struggle. And so what we want to do is present kids with narratives that are going to strengthen them with hope. Because I know in times that are dark in my life, I want to go back and read The Lord of the Rings. Because when I do,
Yes.
I think this rings true. This is the kind of universe that we live in, that
Yeah.
ultimately it is not going to be a final defeat, that ultimately there is going to be a joyful turning and there is going to be a good ending in the final chapter
Yeah.
of this story. And so I think that is just, if it's essential to me as a grown up, it's even more important for a child to have those narratives that strengthen and form the mind to be able to imagine a hopeful ending.
This is, I think, what you're talking about, Haley. When you said, I think when contemporary children's books fail, it's because of a lack of respect for the child reader. I mean, can you elaborate on that? Or is it the matter of you're not giving them the sense of hope that exists? You're actually turning this into a false narrative of hopelessness, of despair, of victimizer or being victimized. Can you say a word or two just about respecting the child reader, what that means?
Absolutely. And this is really key to our mission at Word on Fire Spark, is that we want everything we publish to respect the child reader. And there's a lot of facets to that. One of those is that we're presenting something that's really beautiful
Mm,
and really high quality because we have respect for the person that is reading this. Um, and then also there's a sense that to respect the child reader, we can't offer wishful thinking
yeah.
or just positive thinking in place of real hope. That children are smart and they recognize when they're being offered something that's not the whole story. So to respect the child reader isn't saying we're going to, whitewash the story, we're going to take out anything that makes us uncomfortable, but it's offering something that rings with truth.
Yeah.
And so for instance, our first book written by Alexi Sargent, which is stories of the saints and stories about the saints and animals. Some of these saints were martyred,
Mm,
and he tells the story, and I think that that's really important and a way of respecting the child reader to say, hey, you are a person who can wrestle with this sort of complicated story and see that there is this beautiful redemption,
yeah.
that there is this really true hope in this story, and we're not going to just give you something that skims the surface or is presenting you with merely positive thinking instead of real hope, because I think kids notice right away.
Yeah.
They notice this isn't true.
That's so true in the sense that kids graduate from very, very, very simplistic but important fairy tale stories to tales with greater complexity because to some extent they hunger for, to my way of thinking and experiencing this with my own daughters, they hunger for something that's more representative of the way the world is, but also retains that great sense of hope and joy that we know that our faith promises us and delivers to us time and time again. And so it seems like they just wander from the oversimplified, saccharine kind of, everything is just perfect and this person's perfect and this person's just undeniably evil and there's nothing else to be said about them. They move from that to the regions of complexity. In part, I think, because they get bored with the former, and then secondly, they also they crave guidance, and in these complex narratives, like the Lord of the Rings, these complex narratives where there is good and evil, but it kind of like Solzhenitsyn says, runs, the line separates it is within every human heart. They're hungering to figure out how do I grapple this, not consciously, but how do I grapple with this as I navigate my own life's woes. So I think that that's so what a great backbone for an endeavor, Word on Fire Spark, to be doing that. I want to ask you, Haley, what have you learned by raising your own children about children's literature?
Sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that has surprised me is how much children are eager to share a common story with you. Children really it builds up the family culture in a really beautiful way to have a shared story. So all of the road trips that we've taken listening to audiobooks that we all listen to together, now all those characters, those stories are things that get referenced in our conversations, and we have this to share. I think that is really beautiful and important. And I think that often the struggle to get kids interested in reading, it's kind of, we're expecting them to go on this journey themselves. And that's the goal, is eventually they're going to embark on these journeys with books themselves. But I wonder if some of the hesitation can be overcome when we journey with them, when we read aloud, when we listen to audiobooks together, and we're kind of showing them and modeling for them how to engage with these stories and what a delight it is to share the stories together.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Saintly Creatures. A wild boar ran for his life through an oak forest of 5th century Ireland. Amidst the frenzy of a battlefield, a lone horse galloped furiously. A pair of black feathered baby birds cawed plaintively from anew in the deep, dark woods. These are just a few of the opening lines of Alexi Sargent's Saintly Creatures, 14 tales of animal and their holy companions. This beautifully illustrated book is newly released and the first release from Word on Fire Spark. So first, Haley, tell us a little bit about Alexi and what inspired him to craft this work.
Sure. Well, Alexi is a writer. He's written for many publications. He's a teacher. He and his wife, Leah Labresco, are also game makers. So they make games. And he and his wife had 2 little girls, and he became really interested in wanting to have stories available for them that would encourage them to become saints and inspire them to become saints. And so it was really providential because we had an idea on our Spark wish list. We'd love to publish a book about saints and animals. And then just a couple of weeks later, I got an email from Alexi saying, hey, I don't know if you're accepting anything yet, but I had this idea and I wanted to present it. And so it was just kind of a match made in heaven. And then we found this incredible illustrator. And it was just an incredible project to get to work on and to see it all come together. Alexi's writing is so engaging. The way he tells the stories, it's exciting. He uses beautiful language. So yeah, it was a delight to work on it. We're so pleased with it.
My daughters, when they were much younger, they're now 16 and 14, but when they were much younger, had these little books, Lives of the Saints books that were, kind of more dense, writing and these pictures and a little bit dated and so on, but they loved it. And needless to say, there was a lot of gory endings to these unfortunate martyred saints and so on, but they were inspired by them, and this was a library for them from which to draw for for their patron saint names for the sacraments that would ultimately come up. I will say that Alexi's book, it is gorgeous. It is approachable. I mean, I lay down at night with my younger daughter and we read a couple and kind of go through these. Tell me a little bit about the illustrator, Anita, and I'm not going to try to pronounce her last name because I know I won't do it justice. Could you?
Sure. So Anita is an Italian illustrator. I actually found her through Instagram. I saw her art come up, and her style is just incredibly intricate, very detailed, colorful, and beautiful. And we wanted a style that would be both really fresh and exciting, and also have this kind of classic feel that could harken back to sacred art and icons of the saints. And so she just did it brilliantly. I mean, it was just better than we could have imagined. Every time she'd send in a new illustration, we were all freaking out. They were so beautiful. So she was just incredible to work with, and I think really enjoyed. I think as an Italian, she'd say, the saints are really important to us here in Italy. This is so fun to work on. So that was just delightful.
I want to make sure I say it's Anita Bargiani, if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly.
I think it's Bargiani.
Bargiani. Okay. But I want you. Everybody should go out and buy this book first and foremost. But second of all, pay as much attention to the illustrations, obviously, as you are to the text, because Alexi and Anita are just a power-packed combo in terms of telling the story of the saints and the animals. From Saint Rita and the bees to Saint John Bosco and the great gray dog, these brief stories cross cultures and continents with a warm unfolding of God's creation of noble souls and curious animals. I want to ask you, and you've already alluded to it, but what is the key to making saints and their stories approachable to young readers? Because again, there's so many things they could be reading. They're on phones at certain ages, or they're looking at a Kindle, they're watching, Netflix. We're trying to get kids to read, but then we're trying to get kids to read about saints. What's the key beyond what you said to me already, Haley?
I think one thing that's key is communicating that these are real people. These aren't, cookie cutter holy people. These are real people who had, certain talents, certain weaknesses, certain preferences, certain hopes and dreams. And if you can kind of help the child get to know that person, then they're going to be invested and engaged in their story and better able to imagine themselves as a saint. What would I do in this situation? What kind of way might God be calling me to become holy? And so I think that that's the key, is to just help invite them into this friendship with those saints.
Is that, out of curiosity, is that a special, would you say your relationship with the saints is a special relationship, seeing that you came to the Catholic Church from the outside, that you once didn't necessarily have the same appreciation then that you do now?
I think absolutely. I mean, getting to know the saints has been one of the most exciting things about our conversion, and having these models and stories, just seeing the variety of ways that people can live incredibly holy lives in the situation that God has placed them and the plan he has for them. I'm going to get this quote wrong because I'm just saying it off the top of my head, but Pope Benedict has a quote about how the only truly effective apologia is the lives of the saints and the art that the church has produced in her womb. And so I think about that, the power of story. Human beings are wired to understand the world through stories. And so when we have the stories of the saints helping shape our faith, that is hugely important. And in times of doubt, when I think about the lives of the saints, that is a huge boost to my faith. It kind of helps bring me back to my faith in those difficult times.
It makes me think of a long car ride in the Stewart car with an audiobook on, and mom and dad and the kids are all listening together. the saints' stories are the saints' lives accompany us. I mean, actually, in memory, but also in ongoing communion. As a former Protestant, now Catholic, I will tell you the role of saints in intercessory prayer in my life has exploded, and I couldn't imagine not having that cloud of witnesses with me through the daily trials and triumphs of my life. And so, once again, it just testifies to the importance of a book like this being put in the hands in a beautiful form, told in a beautiful way of young kids, so that they can start that journey with the saints at this sensitive age.
Absolutely. And I think that, especially for children, but for all of us, God is so big.
Yeah.
It is so hard for us to wrap our minds around. We cannot wrap our minds around God. And so it is helpful to have these intercessors with these incredible lives that we can look to, that point us to God, who show us things about God. And I for instance, I have devotion to Saint Joseph. And one of the things I love about Saint Joseph is that there's a sense of his tender fatherly affection, his fatherly love, that then I can imagine better. Oh, that's right. That's the way that God loves us. He has this tender fatherly love. And if I can imagine the way that St. Joseph loves me, then he points me on, and I can imagine, oh, that's right. That's how God loves me. And so it's this link and drawing us closer to God, which is what the saints love to do.
I love that, rendering God more approachable by having facets of God emanating from the lives of the saints. I think that's wonderful. Haley, C.S. Lewis once observed, "No book is really worth reading at the age of 10, which is not equally, and often far more, worth reading at the age of 50 and beyond." How do these stories in this book, how do they galvanize faith in the young, but also the old alike?
Sure. I love that quote by Lewis. There's another one by Madeline L'Engle who says, "If it's not good enough for kids, it's not good enough for grown-ups," which is, that's a great rule of thumb. If you are a grown-up reading a children's book thinking, I can't wait till this is over, it is not good enough for the child you're reading it to either.
It's a good litmus test, yes.
So I love that. But I learned so much just editing this book. And I know Alexi learned so much writing this book, learning new stories about the saints that he didn't know before. And so that's a joy too, is there are so many saints, there are so many stories that we have yet to dive into. And it's exciting to continue.
Could there conceivably be another volume of? I know you have 1,000 things on your plate, but there are so many saints. I imagine the reception of this book has been so good so far. Is there a conceivable room for more works like this coming out of Spark?
Absolutely. I think we'd love to do another book with Alexi and Anita. They were such a great team, and I think there's a lot of different directions we could go for a follow-up book. But we'd love to do that.
Great. Segment 4, The Greater Impact. According to Russell Kirk, it is the moral imagination which informs us concerning the dignity of human nature, which instructs us that we are more than naked apes. As Edmund Burke suggested in 1790, letters and learning are hollow if deprived of the moral imagination. And the spirit of religion long sustained this moral imagination, along with a whole system of manners. If such moral imagination is lacking, then we are cast forth from this world of reason and order and peace and virtue and fruitful penitence into the antagonist world of madness, discord, vice, confusion, and unavailing sorrow. So, Haley, let's talk a little bit about your being an editor of Word on Fire Spark, which is the children's literature arm of Word on Fire Publishing. I want to first ask you, what role does the moral imagination play in all of the books that you are publishing?
Yeah, this has a huge role for us. I mean, we talked earlier about respect for the child reader as one of our big guiding principles, but this is another big guiding principle. And it also ties into everything we've been talking about narrative. How do we form a child's understanding of who they are in the story? what it means to live a good life, what it means to be a good person. So what holiness looks like. And so I think that this is key to the whole project of providing children with good literature, is forming those moral imaginations. And I think that it's particularly important when there are so many stories circulating that do the opposite of this, that are telling a story that isn't true. And I think a good example of this is something like Game of Thrones, which I think is over its heyday, but for a while was very influential, where it's this fantasy world in which there are really no good people. It's you're either a victim of someone's oppression or you're the oppressor. And their power and greed, these are the driving factors of human beings. And that is simply the way that people are. And if you believe that, that is a very, very bleak world that you're entering. If this is you think that this is what it means to be a human being. And so I think it's just could not be more important to provide narratives that tell the truth and that are offering models and inspiration for what it looks like to be fully human, to be called to love, to be called to sacrifice, that all of these things are what make us who we are. And this is who we are on the deepest level. We are the people that God created us to be, not merely the summation of all of our failures or worst impulses. And so I think that this forming of the moral imagination that we see in fairy tale archetypes and as kind of the starting point, that we really need to build on that to provide compelling, exciting, true narratives to form children's imagination. And we haven't published any young adult fiction yet. But that's something I would really like. I would really like to do that. I mean, it's not easy to write a really high quality young adult fiction novel, but I would love for better stories to be entering the world, in addition to, the wonderful ones we have like Lord of the Rings, that we could have more stories that are telling the truth.
And talk about, especially for the teenage, I mean, like you said, the young adult, I mean, that what a wide open niche that needs air supply to be able to be able to kind of be ennobled. And that's the word you made me think about, is what you're doing is you're promoting things that are ennobling. It's interesting the amount of stories on Netflix or in film or popular books or so on, that where people say, I don't think any person in here is a good person. Nobody really resonates with me, but I'm rooting for this person. I'm rooting for Tony Soprano. I'm rooting for, so if at the end of the day, the only people you can root for are the protagonist, who is an evil person, but you're like, well, that's the only person I got to root for. That is very warping, that it's deforming in its own right. And so, I mean, once upon a time, there were more Little House on the Prairies and so on, where there was a moral core and there was doing the right thing and standing up for honorable notions and so on and so forth. That which is ennobling has fallen out of favor. And so to some extent, what you're doing with Word on Fire Spark, what I think Word on Fire as a ministry is doing and the Catholic Church is doing in general, is it's being profoundly countercultural. Chesterton has a line that says, in this, I think it's in Thomas Aquinas, says, every generation is converted by the saint that contradicts it the most. And in many respects, producing a book that's beautiful and also mature and is complex and yet inspiring, a children's book on the saints is profoundly countercultural. So I think it's phenomenal that you're doing that. And I wish you well also on the young adult fiction side of things, because it's extraordinarily important that you're able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I just pinch myself because I can't imagine having more fun with a job. It's exciting, it's fun, and we have so many books kind of coming down the pike that are just going to be wonderful. So it's the hardest part is keeping things under wraps until I'm allowed to publicly announce things, because I just want to tell everyone everything.
Well, I have like one or two more questions, and that was one of them. Now you're already kind of you're basically telling me, unless we can go off the air and you can pull the curtain back. Do we have some titles and themes, or let's just say, are there some themes that readers can look forward to in the coming year or two?
So we have several really exciting books coming out soon. Our last 2023 releases are a beautiful board book called Bless the Lord, which is the canticle from the book of Daniel that's prayed in Liturgy of the Hours. So it's just beautifully illustrated, and it's so that a toddler can participate in family prayer of Liturgy of the Hours, or bring with them to Mass to have something to hold, to engage with prayer. And then we have a really exciting first book in a series. It's our Spark Classic series, and it's George MacDonald's The Golden Key and two of his other fairy tales, The Light Princess and Little Daylight. And so our dream for this series is that it will bring some classic children's books that are really worth reading back into the conversation, maybe books that have just kind of been forgotten over the years, but are just beautiful, that do that forming of the moral imagination. And George MacDonald was a huge influence on C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and any fantasy writer who came after him. And so it's a really fun beginning book for the series. But I think it's kind of sets the stage for that forming of, what kind of world do I live in? Is this a world in which love and sacrifice are able to conquer the evil in the world? And so we're really excited about that. It's a beautiful new edition with beautiful illustrations, full page illustrations. So we can't wait for that. And then next year we have several different titles. One that I'm really excited about is about Venerable Jérôme Lejeune, who was a geneticist who discovered the chromosomal component of Down syndrome and then became a fierce advocate for the pro-life movement. And it's just a beautiful picture book biography, because we really want to communicate to children that faith and science go hand in hand. These things are not opposed to each other. And to lay that foundation with really inspiring stories of Catholic scientists, and just see that played out. So we have a lot of good stuff coming out over the next couple of years.
It's amazing. Well, out of curiosity, Mark Bradford is one of our fellows that does such great work with those with intellectual or developmental disabilities. I presume that he'll have or has some input with respect to that.
Yes. He wrote the afterword to this Jérôme Lejeune book, and was just incredibly helpful the whole process as we were editing and verifying different things about Lejeune's life. But yeah, he's fantastic.
Marvelous. Really quickly, I want to ask Haley. So here you are, you're in this wonderful position. You're busy as all get out. You're editing for Word on Fire Spark, and a manuscript lands on your desk. And I'm just curious, what makes you look at a manuscript and say, aha, I want to publish this one?
Sure. I mean, usually it doesn't take long. And part of it is just, is the language really beautiful? As I read it, am I engaged? And am I moved to wonder by the beauty of this language? Is this story something that leads me to wonder? And then from there, is this a concept that really is important for us to communicate to children? There's a lot of I get a lot of beautifully written proposals that they're great. They're just not, they're not going to take one of those few spots we have on the publishing calendar that we think these are the most important books to get out there. So it's interesting, because sometimes I'll write back, this isn't going to be a good fit for us, but this is great. It's a beautiful story. It's great. And so it's interesting being on the other side of that. As a writer, I know what it's like to get those rejection emails.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it's always hard for me to write them, but we can only accept so many projects, and we have to choose just the very, very best ones that are the best fit for our mission.
Finally, Haley, you've been so generous with your time, so thank you for having this conversation. What impact, as you look at the landscape ahead, what impact do you hope your work will have on the many readers that are growing and reading your books as we speak?
Sure. Well, I think that several things, but I think that one thing is forming the taste of the child for really good things. Um, that that's so important, and there's no easy or quick way to do that. It's just engaging really beautiful books and really
Mhm.
beautiful stories and help form that taste for what's beautiful. And I think when we do that, then kids are more critical of things that don't respect them. They'll say, this isn't
Yeah.
this isn't a very good book. Um, and so I think that that is one thing I hope for, that this will be part of forming this taste for beauty, because beauty leads us to God. Beauty is this path that points us to the source of all beauty. And so that is one piece of it. And connected to that, pointing us to God, that these books would form these young hearts for the gospel, that they would
Mhm.
prepare them and form them to reach for the gospel and be influenced by the gospel in the whole way that they view the world and view themselves and view other people, and that would just lead them closer to Christ.
It's wonderful. I mean, and as a good friend of mine would say, why settle for the weak sauce when the banquet sits in front of you? Wonderful, wonderful work, Haley, as a leader, as a visionary for this, and also congratulations to Alexi and Anita out there for a wonderful first production that I know is going to have make an impact on many, many people. Haley Stewart, wife, mother, reader, editor of Word on Fire Spark, and an all-around good person. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Todd. This was wonderful.
So I've been thinking. During the Sermon on the Mount, as captured in the 7th chapter of Matthew, Jesus asks his listeners, which one of you would hand his son a stone when he asks for a loaf of bread, or a snake when he asks for a fish? We all know the answer to this question. No one. No one who is worthy of the honorific father or mother would ever provide their child with anything other than that which is good for them. Our children need their bodies sustained with good food, warmed with decent clothing, and protected with a safe home. But is that all? What about our children's souls? As parents entrusted with the bodily care of our children, we are also the first guardians of their souls. In a world of chaos and nihilism, disorder and decadence, we are charged with the weighty responsibility of forming our children's character and cultivating their interior life. We are, from our children's very conception, charged with molding them for Christ. But how do we do that? How do we compete with the endless distractions and stealthy diversions that will draw our children away from God? There is no simple answer for this, much less one that can be shoehorned into the end of a podcast. But let me at least offer this. In our homes, we have to craft a habit of being, a rhythm of life that roots itself in prayer and the sacraments, service and sacrifice, conversation and accompaniment. To do this, our children need to know what this life looks like, and they will see it in us, their parents, if we model it for them and encourage them to do the same. Our children will also be formed by the things that they read. Imagination in the young is essential, but moral imagination is indispensable. As Haley Stewart mentioned in our conversation, children need to be immersed in that which is ennobling. What a curious, outdated, and quaint term ennobling is. And yet it is exactly what our children need and honestly crave. To be reminded of their God-kissed dignity, to be accompanied in their calling, to be resilient through their suffering, and to be grateful for God's limitless grace, these are the hallmarks of the ennobled soul. To recognize that you should not have wandered from the straight path like Little Red Riding Hood, to maintain your character in the midst of your suffering like Cinderella, and to own your misdeeds and start anew like Pinocchio is formative and ennobling. To learn from mentors like Dante, leave space for grace like Charles Ryder, or to keep the faith like Alyosha Karamazov is formative and ennobling. To paraphrase Flannery O'Connor, our children need stories because a statement would be inadequate. G.K. Chesterton once noted, My first and last philosophy, that which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learned in the nursery. Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. And nostalgic for his old toy theater that he filled with self-directed moral dramas in his youth, Chesterton mused, "It is an old story, and for some a sad one, that in a sense these childish toys are more to us than they can ever be to children. I do not look back. I look forward to this kind of puppet play. I look forward to the day when I shall have time to play with it. Some day when I am too lazy to write anything or even read anything, I shall retire into this box of marvels, and I shall be found still striving hopefully to get inside a toy theater." Children's literature, the ennobling kind, will do just that. It will help our children to have grand souls, and it just might help us too. And one last thing. For this week's book, I'd recommend Grimm's Fairy Tales. For as long as I can remember, I've sat next to my daughter late in the evening and explored the Greek myths, Aesop's fables, and Grimm's fairy tales. And as we dive into these original stories of outlandish creatures and extraordinary circumstances, we can apprehend the moral narrative that threads through each one. I think my daughter likes these stories, and so do I. As C.S. Lewis once said, "I'm inclined to set it up as a canon that a children's story that is enjoyed only by children is a bad children's story." Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization of Culture podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.